right. Hello, everyone. I just want to double check that everyone can hear me out there. I want to thank you all for coming today. And if you have any issues, just let me know. Um, so, welcome to Fake News for Multiple Audiences. We are going to be talking about how to present this information to a variety of audiences that you may run into. I am coming from a public library background, so I'm talking about a lot of different portions of the community or different things that I've interacted with over my time here. I'm also just going to give a heads up warning. Somebody just set off a confetti cannon in my library about 20 minutes ago, and I'm the only supervisor here. So if there are more shenanigans, I may be called out and we may have to cut this short. But I hope not, so that we have this time together today. So what we're going to cover today is I'm going to talk a little bit through my fake news story. So how I got involved in teaching this in the first place, where it's kind of gone, and how it's changed over time. Then we're going to talk about overcoming the expertise gap, and then we're going to talk about the meat of this, how you adjust this content based on time, age and education, technology, and audience. Because all of those have been things that I've had to adjust and interact with as I've changed my approach to this instruction. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mack Freeman. I've been a public librarian for the last 10 years. I've worked in circulation, marketing, and right now I'm a branch manager with the Gwinnett County Public Library. I was the 2019 chair of ALA's Intellectual Freedom Roundtable, and I'm the current chair of GLA's Intellectual Freedom Interest Group. So I've had a long-standing interest in the accuracy of information and disinformation and how we can better teach that to people. So here's kind of my journey into fake news education, which was never something that I thought that I'd be teaching quite as much. So in January of 2018, the Adult Programming Department at Gwinnett County Public reached out to me about doing a program on fake news. We were interested in this because it was still something that was being talked about quite a bit, even after the 2016 election had, clearly been a couple of years in the past. And it was something that we had never really addressed as a library system. The reason that they reached out to me is because I've had some intellectual freedom background, and they couldn't get anybody from the journalism or reporting ecosystem to come and talk about it. We reached out to a lot of different people, and they were all like, yes, we think it's very important that people talk about that and that education happens in that area. However, it's too hot for us to handle, so thank you, but no thank you. So they talked to me, and they're like, we can, whenever you're ready, we'll do this. So that March, I did a bunch of research and development, and the presentation was scheduled for that summer. And so I did it as an in-house adult program, and we had about 15 to 20 attendees. And that's where I thought that I was going to be done. My bosses asked me to do something. I presented what I thought was a very nice fake news talk, and I thought that it was just going to be done. So we did this talk. It's called Fake News: Disentangling Truth in the Digital Age. And we kind of walked through all of these sorts of things. Well, from there, it kind of became one of those things that blew up on itself. So one of the attendees worked at a school, at the Gwinnett School of Mathematics, Science, and Technology. And so when the school year started, she invited me to come speak at her media center to a couple of after-school groups. And from there, the adult services person who talked to me asked if I would speak as part of our partnership with Georgia Gwinnett College a few weeks after that. And from there, I have just been kind of speaking to a lot of different age groups and student groups all over Gwinnett County. So I've spoken to Grayson High School, Shiloh Middle, which was my first middle school adaptation, in-service days for media specialists and media clerks. So I kind of thought it had run its course after about a year, but I offered it up to the media specialist listserv, which kind of kept going into other areas. And so adaptations kept coming. So I kept getting requests to speak to schools. The senior group coordinators around the library system started hitting me up, and they'd be like, we need content for our seniors, and they're always talking about the news. So could you come in and do that? And then I did an in-service for English teachers once COVID struck. And then once COVID struck, I had a lot of people asking if I would come speak to their Zoom classrooms at various things around the county. And so it's one of those things where, I was booked and blessed. And so it was really nice to be able to present this. But as you can see from that short rundown, it's a lot of different audiences. There's kind of a general adult audience, a collegiate audience, high schools, middle schools, senior groups, professionals and how they can use it in the classroom. And so while I was able to have the same base level of knowledge and the same kind of core structure, there were a lot of things that I needed to change over time. And so this is, where I kind of had to adapt for multiple audiences as we kept going, because I didn't want to just present the same thing over and over and over, because I wanted it to be the most useful thing for the audience so that they would get some learning out of it and so that the instruction would resonate with them. So the first thing that I wanted to address is kind of overcoming the expertise gap. When you start looking at fake news and disinformation, misinformation, the technology around it, the stories around it, all of the influences, all of that, it's really easy to be quickly overwhelmed. So the first thing I'll say is you don't have to know it all. In fact, you never will know it all. I have been talking about this to various groups for the last 3 years, and I feel like I can just barely hold my own, and I do, I try to stay up on things that are going on, but it all just changes so fast. And so if you are somebody who is interested in presenting about fake news, disinformation, or media literacy of this type, and you haven't before, I would encourage you to kind of start where I did and know that there's a lot of groups that have already put together curriculum that's out there. And so there are resources, so review it and pull what's useful. So there the Digital Resource Center from the Center for News Literacy, the Civic Online Reasoning Project at Stanford, the News Literacy Project, the Center for Media Literacy, the LibGuides by various institutions. I particularly like the one from Cal State Long Beach. There are lots of groups that have already curated this knowledge. There is no need to reinvent the wheel, no matter what audience you're going for or who you're going to go. And so, so I don't reinvent the wheel so you don't have to know it all. And there's no need to be scared of any audience, because you don't have to completely remake your presentation every time you go out for a different age group, a different audience, a different education level or whatever. Because I think that you can basically take the same 3X structure, and if you're presenting one-offs, which is what I mostly do when I'm doing fake news instruction, you can take a 3-act structure that pairs well, whether it's 20 minutes that you've got, 45 minutes, an hour, anything like that. And so my basic 3-act structure for this is, Act 1 is what is fake news. We kind of go through some definitions, talk about what it is, how you know that you're looking at fake news. Then Act 2 is why are we susceptible to fake news, and Act 3 is what can we do about this problem. Put another way, it's Act 1 is what, then why, then now what. So the problem, why is this problem happening, and what can the audience do about it? And this allows me to reframe and restructure the content based on the problem that they are particularly likely to face, so that they are likely to take a couple of things away from it. There's a book that I really enjoy called The Art of Gathering. It's by Priya Parker, who's a professional gatherer and meeting facilitator. And she makes the point that, when you present for any length of time, odds are that the bulk of your content won't be absorbed by your audience. They will remember something up top, something in the middle, and something at the end. And so if you've got a message that you want to be sure that you are getting to them, you want to be sure to be presenting that in those spots along the way, or that the main idea of what you want them to take away is clear apart from all the details that might resonate with them. So as I kept working on this fake news project, one of the things that became clear that I would have to adjust as I started to talk to more and more audiences is that what I addressed changed over time. And it changed for two related reasons, but that ultimately kind of had different effects on how I approached this topic. So the first is my initial focus was on misinformation. So sources of misinformation and common tropes. What does fake news mean? How we're psychologically not suited for the massive amounts of information we get, the profit structure of social media, and then an individual methodology of people protecting themselves. So teaching people things like the craft test and ways that they can personally identify things that are low quality information so that they can better, so that they can see more about what they want and what can be useful for them. And I stand by that initial presentation. I think that it had some solid information in it, and I think that there was nothing in it that was incorrect or nothing in it that was harmful in any sort of way. But I think that it is often one of the easier ways to approach fake news, in that it is misinformation, that it has nefarious people on one side, and it's all about personal responsibility and tracking what you can do to stand against it. And as I kept presenting on this, and as I kept offering fake news instruction over time, the two things that were happening is I was changing in the information that I had available at me and where I was conceiving the main problems and issues to be, and the world was also changing around me. So, I know that it can be like hard to conceive of it, but like fake news as a like word in the contemporary consciousness as something that like everybody was exposed to on some level is only about 6 years old. It really only started right around the time of the announcement of the Trump candidacy in 2015. And so it's a concept that has evolved really quickly, and it's something that, kind of even feels passé now. Like, people are still calling things fake news, but it feels dated even today. And so we're evolved, like misinformation hasn't gone anywhere, but that what is important in it and what people need to, kind of focus on has changed, because, we're seeing a lot less, Macedonian teenagers making millions of dollars in the 2016 election. That has kind of dropped to the wayside in importance as more and more like government disinformation campaigns from foreign bodies become more and more central to the fake news and disinformation conversation, where it's not just politics that are being targeted, but especially over the last year, health has been an enormous concern. The rise of the QAnon conspiracy and its related ecosystem of conspiracies and fear has completely come out of nowhere since I started doing this. And so all of that has had to be incorporated in one way or another into what I talk about, because it is the context that the audience exists in. And so the other, so as I kind of, learned more about it myself also, I moved myself towards a different look at what I was presenting people. So, I started to look at to present more on the systemic issues that people are facing when they go about, trying to address fake news, the filter bubbles, the technology that is enabling this. In addition to the political ecosystem, talking a lot about healthcare, because, with COVID, that was a prime source for the intersection of the two, but also a great area of fear and a great area that was being exploited for profit by a number of people over the last 18 months. There are emerging trends that may be the future of misinformation. So I got particularly interested in how AI is becoming better at replicating human-like speech and the capabilities to produce deep fake video and image that can, pass the sniff test really easily. And that technology has expanded quite a bit over the last 2 years, especially. And then disinformation by governments, like I was saying. So, the more and more information coming from Russia and their contemporaries, North Korea, China, and others that are trying to change the social media conversation and to overall have an effect on the conversation that happens around issues, whether the information is real or not. So another source that I like and I wanted to pass on, especially as it comes to government disinformation, is there was a thing put out by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life called Critical Disinformation Studies, a syllabus. And this is a bit more in-depth than I usually go into in my talks, but it's a 14-part syllabus for how to address disinformation, particularly as it comes from governments in the United States context. So looking at looking at case studies about how the government has been historically complicit in disinformation, how the past has not been epistemically consistent, and how it has changed over time, and power dynamics have always impacted the media, particularly against people of color, queer people, and other marginalized groups. And so this can be especially useful, and I pulled concepts from it to kind of talk about that. There is no central figure in any sort of fake news conversation that has always been correct, or that has always been, the one you could count on. Everybody's a subject of influence. And so it's something that we need to be conscious of, that we can't just like harken back to the past and the good old days. There are no good old days. It's just today and the problems that we're dealing with now. I have a couple of examples of how, just like minor things have changed in my presentation over time. So like one of my go-to examples was, talking about how people are bad at conceiving of numbers. And so, my go-to example is like, what's the most successful film of all time? And when I started this presentation, the most successful film of all time was Avatar. And then Avengers Endgame came out and mucked up my slide. So I had to go in and change it. And the broader point of this slide is that, the most successful movie of all time is Avengers Endgame if you don't adjust for inflation. If you adjust for inflation, it actually is still gone with the wind, $3.1 to $3.3 billion. And so when especially students are looking at things in a historical context, they need to understand whether they are comparing like things to each other or whether the historical context of the information and the news that they're gathering has an effect on what they're talking about. So, it's like, is this the most expensive thing we've ever seen? Is this the most money we've ever spent on this sort of project? Or has that changed over time? So this was also a case where I needed to make sure that I didn't become an accidental source of misinformation. Another thing is I really like this slide. It's all about media consolidation and how we have a lot fewer sources for information than we think that we do, because ostensibly about 6 media giants control 90% of what we watch and listen to. And that was very true in 2012, which is where the source of this information comes from. But that's actually even more consolidated now, because 2 years ago, Disney bought News Corp's news properties in the United States. So now it's really 5 companies that own most of that. If, maybe 6 or 7 if you want to throw Google and Facebook in there as media companies, which I think that there's a fair argument to do. The next, and probably the biggest thing that I thought about as I was adjusting this over time is adjusting for age and education level. So I've talked to students as young as 10 years old, in middle school, and I've talked to people well into their 80s about fake news. And so how do we change this content and address it so that it is appropriate for everybody? Because everybody has information needs. Everybody has something that they can get out of this. And so how am I going to shift up my content, shift my delivery and all of that so that it works better for them? So I use my general adult presentation as a baseline, what I've kind of been talking about up to this point. And so, my adjustments when I talk to collegiate audiences is overall, it's my most similar to my general audience presentation. I never try to over-assume knowledge of news or current events, especially anything that might be local, because students come from all over and they may not be interested in the local, current events of the place that they're living in. But, the other thing is some students are hyper-connected to current events and some are not. And so I never want to assume that people know more than they do, especially when we're dealing with examples. Something I do, a concept that I really like that I try to add in for collegiate audiences that I typically cut for others is this concept of truth decay. This is a report that came out from the RAND Corporation in 2017, but it's basically about how the whole idea of an objective truth, especially as it comes to the news media, is something that is rotting away with time. And so, it's how we are seeing more and more news content coming out that's not actually news, it's opinion-based, and how the veracity of opinion and how people feel is overwhelming objective reality in a lot of ways. And it's more of a higher concept and something that I've tried with younger audiences, and it doesn't usually tend to go. So, but I try to look at more theory and broader trends, that history of disinformation and the critical disinformation studies. This is a kind of a prime audience for that, as far as I'm concerned. My actually favorite group to talk to is seniors. And I've got to tell you, I was nervous about this group at first because, I'm a pinko lefty commie, and in this community, we have a broad variety of political beliefs, and I was a little concerned for, a group that is statistically more likely to be the subject of fake news, to believe in it, to push back against realistic resources. I was worried about, in my initial encounters with this group, that I would have problems. But it turns out that this is the best audience that I've ever presented to as far as engagement, as far as wanting the information. And I think that that's for a couple of different reasons. So first off, they get to choose to be there. They're adults, and they are coming to a senior group and they knew what the topic was ahead of time. So they showed up, and in almost every case, they show up prepared. They have questions written down. They have brought me a newspaper and they want to talk about something. So they are much more looking for a solutions-oriented presentation. The whole why the ecosystem got this way and why we as people are susceptible and all of that, they are interested, but that is not why they bought the ticket. And so for this group, I tend to cut down acts 1 and 2 in that structure I was talking about, like what's the problem and how do we get here? I really talk about more about what we can do. So, are there changes that they can advocate for in their local community? Are there news sources that I particularly recommend? Are there, things that they should be aware of? Are there things that their age group is a particular target for? I try to make sure that there's plenty of that in the presentation because that's really what I found them to be looking for. I also would encourage you, if you ever have the chance to talk about this or any other similar topic to a senior group, give yourself plenty of time for the Q&A, or plan to stay after, because they have questions and they're going to be fascinating questions. So you want to make sure that you've got plenty of time to answer those things over time. So, and then they're broadly informed on current events. So you don't really have to, you can use all of your current modern day examples that you want to go into. And I would also consider that like this might be a time to become a bit more personal. So, there are things that I don't talk about in my general presentation. So like I don't really talk about where I get my news or how I personally, go through information or how I check into sources that are not there, because I know that the way that I approach news and information and literacy like that comes from my worldview, and it comes from, my belief system and what I think is true and accurate and what I'm willing to believe and what I tend to not have a lot of time for. And so if you're willing to kind of become more personable and willing to share that sort of stuff, I found this audience to be generally pretty receptive to that. So, it's like, where do you go for your non-biased news? So it's like the BBC, especially if it's American politics, because they tend not to have a dog in that fight. The Christian Science Monitor, places like that. Or, if I read the Huffington Post, I just acknowledge that it's got a huge lefty slant, or Talking Points memo for that matter. And, but I know the bias that I'm getting into. And so, yeah. Another big group that I've talked to is a lot of middle schoolers. This was not a group that I initially thought that I would ever present this to, but it's one where I had a large positive response from the community. And so this is the one that I would say is the most different from my baseline talk. And I really try to focus this on the problems that I feel like this audience is facing immediately. And a lot of that has to do with social media literacy, information that they're receiving digitally, and, being aware of the limitations of their own skill set. So, being able to identify misinformation. I cut almost all of the theory. I talk about the interesting stuff about like how, I try to make sure that everything that is there is all about what they can do. I also tend not to go in this presentation more than 5 to 8 minutes without a question to ask them, an activity to do, a poll, something like that. It's an audience that's easy to lose. And so I try to, I try to incorporate that whenever possible. And so I, add more and more, fake images from social media and deep fake videos and all of that sort of stuff, because that tends to resonate and they tend to remember those things. And then, I've heard, as I'm walking out that like they will discuss it amongst themselves, or like, they'll start like, joking with each other about that. I try to make sure in those interactivity breaks that they're kind of understanding that, I can ask questions, that they are responding. And if I can find somebody in the class that wants to be my adversary and be the smartest kid in the room, I love them, because, that smart pushback kid, they will go back and forth with me. And so it can be more of a conversation and we can have a moment. And so there's a lot that can be offered on that can be really useful for there. The other thing I'll say is that the Q&A is likely to be a struggle. The teacher will push for it and be like, does anybody have any questions? Sometimes, especially if you've got that pushback kid, you can have a pretty decent Q&A with middle school students, especially if it's like 6th grade. By the time they're in 8th grade, they're a little too cool to talk to somebody from the library. So I usually try to have a solution in my back pocket. What I usually do is I have something that is cool and related, but doesn't fit in the talk. So like right now, it's been a lot of deep fake content. So it's like, cool. Well, if you've got some time, let's take 10 minutes on deep fakes. Let me show you some videos and some pictures, and let's talk about how creepy this technology is. Or privacy, like let's, all your information's out there and it's for sale. So what does that mean for the future? And how do you feel about that? And so you can kind of do like mini intellectual freedom discussion part two if you've got the time, and and they want you to fill the full hour. High school is kind of the in between of middle school and my general presentation. So I usually try to theme it to the class that's brought me in. So like if it's a journalism class, I try to amp up the talk about journalism and news outlets and the decline in the number of reporters per capita over the last 13 years, and the profit structure of media and advertorials and things like that. If it's English class, then I try to do more things around misinformation and citing and appropriately citing sources and understanding where you think. And if it's a history class, then we lean on the historical examples, talk about yellow journalism, talk about jazz journalism, and how we're having a moment of distrust in the media, but this has kind of come before, and so we have some antecedents for what we're talking about. High school students are too cool to talk to you by and large, or if they're not too cool to talk to you, they're too cool to talk to you in front of their friends. So I will try some interaction, but if it's not flying, I tend to just start skipping it. Some classes have been great, some have been absolutely atrocious, and you just kind of put on your energy and do that. So I try to design the questions for their interest. So like that large scale numbers thing that I was talking about with the movies, something where they can pop culture get the right answer, that tends to go pretty decently. And then also I just try to focus on the 10% that care. In most high school classes I've been into, I'm a guest speaker, so it's a different sort of environment than what they're usually doing. So unless the teacher has made an assignment out of this that they have to do, about 10% are interested in what I'm saying, 40% are at least listening to me, and half are playing on their phones. So I can't control that because I'm not the teacher and I'm not there to whip them into shape. So I just I focus on the 10% that is really getting it and try to make sure that they are understanding it and that we're focusing on the things that they seem to be responding to. A big thing that I've had to look at over the last year is I've had to adjust for technology. I would say that, as we all have over the last year, I've always given this talk in person, and I didn't realize how much that was part of my shtick until I didn't have the audience in the room, because you're just saying a lot about focus on the people who seem like they're engaged. Well, that's a lot harder to see on a Zoom call, where people might not even have their video on. It's a lot harder to make people laugh or cut a weird joke and know if it landed. And so it's been a big transition where teachers have been really very interested in this context, and I've had probably just as many bookings in the last year as I did the year before, but it's different. And so when I moved from in-person to online, some things that I kind of learned along with that is I had to increase the text level on my slides. As you could see from the couple of demo slides that I showed you earlier, I tend to do nothing but graphics on my slides if I can help it. If I've got words on there, they are minimal, and because I'm there talking, and so I don't want people reading my slides while I'm talking. Well, when I made the move to digital, people are distracted by things in their office, or they have their email up, or they may miss something, or the audio may glitch out for a second. And so I don't want them to miss everything that's going on, and I can't see what's happening with them. So I had to increase the text level on all of my slides to make sure that they can see that, while also considering that many people are not logging on from a traditional desktop computer. They're on phones or they're on tablets. So if I want them to look at a slide, I need the text to be large enough that it is visible and easily interactable. Easy to interact with, no matter the device that they are using. So I also try to make more interactive moments. So, using the polling feature that's involved in there, trying to get people to respond in the chat, asking questions, trying to use the Q&A feature, raise hands, whatever it is out there, so that people can, feel like they're part of an interactive thing and that they're not alone in their room. The problem with interactivity on Zoom is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. My trick to it is no matter how successful or unsuccessful the interactivity was, I pretend like I had great participation. So it always feels like everybody sent all sorts of things, and if you didn't see them in the general chat, it's just because they sent it to the instructor directly. And if it's not working, that's fine. It's just an hour. We've all been through we've all been through presentations where the audience wasn't feeling it. You just kind of get to the end of it. The platform delay, you just check and see if there is a platform delay on any of the environments that you're using. I think the BlueJeans platform in particular has like a 10 to 20-second delay for the closed captioning that it does. So just be aware of that if you are using a platform that you're unfamiliar with, so that if you're asking questions and you feel like you've paused forever and there's no response, there may be a reason. And so that may be helpful to know about. And, just try to, whatever sort of energy you have in person, try to amp that up, especially if you're talking to younger people, because a lot of that doesn't translate by a video. It's better than nothing, and I'm glad we had it during the pandemic, but it will never be my optimal way of interacting with people or trying to talk to people or present to others. So a lot of energy can overcome some of that, and it can help kind of show things, that you're excited about it and that maybe they want to care. The other thing is you will have a lot less control over the Q&A. So, kids may ask a lot of questions, they may ask none. It depends on how involved the teacher wants to be. And honestly, this year more than any, I have had teachers on Zoom calls throw me curveballs. I will make an oblique reference to something, and that is what they want the Q&A to be about. What I will say, though, is if you're not prepped in your Q&A, but you're ready to do some stuff on the fly, if you're presenting via technology, you have a lot greater ability to pull up new examples, to show off things that you don't normally show off, to go to some of your favorite websites and show people things that maybe didn't fit in the presentation, but that are great examples for the Q&A. That can be really easy to do with all the screen sharing and all. Whereas, if you're, like I normally just use a clicker when I'm talking, so like the computer may be on the other side of the room and may not be as accessible for those sorts of hands-on, look at this example sort of thing. The last thing that I want to talk about for adjustment-wise is to adjust for the people in the room. And so what I mean by this is that sometimes when you are talking about fake news or misinformation, especially these days, there can be some fear and some reticence that the people in the room are going to put you on blast, as the kids say, or that they will challenge you, that they will be aggressive, that they will be confrontational, because you are not presenting their version of the news or their version of the reality of the world. And that's a thing. I mean, it does happen. We've all seen, clips of people haranguing others, politicians and the like, for not, believing in their belief du jour. I tend to call these people the tinfoil hat society. And I say that with love. They may attend, probably will, especially if you open it up to the public. What I have kind of found, and what I try to find with every audience or with every person who try to ask me a question, is to find a place of compassion to come from in their question. If they've taken time out of their life to attend a talk on fake news and disinformation and whatnot, oftentimes the people who come to these talks are coming because they have some level of fear about the world. The world has changed. Things are very different. They feel like they can't get a good handle on the truth or what they believe those around them don't believe. And that can be very scary and that can be very concerning. And I try to acknowledge that and to be sensitive to that. So on the one hand, I try to recognize that people have sincerely held beliefs, even if they aren't mine. On the other hand, I was like, I may be out there on this, but there still is some objective reality that we're trying to, hold on to with both hands. So there are some things that you can do, and these people tend to come up mostly in the Q&A. So first off is sometimes these people like to monologue in their question. They get up to ask a question, but really it's a monologue to start out with. So if you need to, you can always cut them off. Pick a point when they take a breath and be like, actually, that's wonderful, and just start talking again. Because if you've got the mic or you're at the front of the room, you're in charge. So don't give up your power just because somebody is trying to take you off the rails. The other thing is, I would say to focus on the part of the question you want to answer. So one of my go-to examples of this is one of the very first times I made this talk. I had somebody come in and he was talking about how, the news media is all corrupt and the government's corrupt and all this sort of stuff. And how kids don't know anything these days. And so I just kind of cut him off and I was like, yeah, absolutely. Media literacy is so important because kids are, very unlikely to be able to identify misinformation at middle school at this level. And, a lot of people can't recognize poor sources when they're freshmen in college and all of that. And that's why your local media specialists and your public librarians and your academic librarians do so much work on teaching these sorts of things. And then you can go off and sell whatever you want to sell. I don't want to talk about the government corrupt. I don't want to talk about the media corrupt, but I will talk about the efforts that are currently happening in your community around media literacy. Always happy to talk about that. So, and then the other thing is practice your neutral face. Some people have very expressive faces. Some people are the people who can kind of take everything and it just kind of washes over them and it's not a huge concern. Either one of those is fine, but if you have a more expressive face or something where you kind of wear your reaction on your sleeve, it's probably worth it to practice, a couple of minutes in a webcam or a mirror, people saying wild stuff to you and you just kind of taking it. And that's a personal thing, but it also helps people feel respected and listened to and all of that, no matter what's going on. The audience is going to have a lot of different energies no matter where you go. Some of them are going to have tons of questions. They're going to have things that they are particularly interested in. They are going to have particular bugbears, that they want to talk about. And all of that's fine. You don't have to be an expert about all of it. And you can always say, I don't know. I've just had to tell people that sometimes, it's like, especially if they're a local, library user, I'll be like, I don't know. I mean, if you want to leave your email address, I'm happy to email you in a couple of days and see if I can find something for you. But you don't have to be an expert just because you're up there talking about something. You can just be somebody who's like, we're on this journey together, and here are my tools, and here's what I know at this point, but we're going to have to work on this together. So, a little bit of a shorter presentation for this, but I just, wanted to say in conclusion, fake news as a label is not incredibly useful as the conversation keeps moving. As I mentioned, fake news kind of feels as like kind of dated these days. So misinformation, disinformation, these terms are likely to become more out there, conspiracies even. But all of it really boils down to the same sorts of media literacy tools, whether you're going to talk about individual protection or systemic issues, this conversation needs to keep going. And teaching about misinformation and its many, 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 many forms will never go out of style. So if you are teaching it now or whether you're considering teaching it in the future, I would encourage you to take a look at something, whatever might be useful for you, for your community, for your audiences, and get started and find your way. Because once you've built the first one, editing it for future groups and being able to respond to requests that you might get or other audiences that you think might benefit from it becomes very, very easy, and so the amount of time you have to put in once that first investment is over is very small. And honestly, I mean, there are probably people out there, myself included, who are happy to share their notes and their presentations if you want to get started with your particular audience. So that is what I had to say today about fake news and how to present it, and adapt it for multiple audiences. Does anyone have any questions? All right. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So if anybody thinks of any questions that they want to ask me after the fact, or you have any questions about fake news or adapting, especially if you're going out to public audiences, please feel free to email me. I'm always happy to talk about this, and I dropped my email in the chat in case anybody needs it. So Amy asked if I had ever taught it to college professors. I haven't. I would be very interested in doing that. Because I think that it's something that people all need to be aware of, and even, people who think that they know quite a bit about this, if you've never really done a deep dive into it, my favorite go-to statistic is the people who are the most likely to be fooled are people who think they're too good to be fooled. And so I think that, I would be open to a college professor audience, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. All right, well, in that case, I am going to sign off. Thank you all for coming today. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you have a fantastic time at my favorite named conference I've ever been to. More conferences should have fun names like Glitter. And I hope to And I hope to see you all in the near future.